Climate, talking about the impact of the climate change in people's daily, the biological and ecological impact of climate change. So we're very pleased to welcome Professor Charles Sheppard from Life Sciences, who works on these things. He's going to talk to us about climate change and the effects on ecosystems. So.
Right, well, good morning. I'll split this into two, so we have a break halfway through. Now, one thing I want to convey to you is people often talk about climate change, what will happen. I'm going to talk about and want to emphasize the fact that a lot of it is well underway. Effects on ecosystems are well underway. As a shorthand, you can say six-figure numbers of people die every year because of it. It's not something for the future, it is, but it's also something that is happening already, and I'm going to show you a few numbers as well to show you just how far along the line we've got for some of the more sensitive ecosystems of the world. These are the sort of broad topics I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to emphasize the marine system because I'm a marine scientist, and I'm going to emphasize coral reefs because I work a lot in reefs. Why? Well, not only because of British kind of winters, it's nice out there, but also because they are the most sensitive ecosystem responding to climate change. They're also the world's most biodiverse system, if you forget cockroaches, which sort of dominate in the Amazon and make them the most sort of diverse. At higher taxonomic sort of levels, they are by far the most diverse ecosystem. They are the most productive ecosystem when it comes to feeding people. Okay, Australian sugarcane fields are more productive, but they're highly artificial and have loads of chemicals and fertilizer shoved on them. But for natural systems, reefs are the most productive as well. So they've got the most species, genera, families, they've got the highest amount of production, and about 1 billion people in the world are dependent on them, as I'm going to come. So I'm going to use them as an example. But when I get down to 6 and 7, well, after number 5 actually, I'm going to put it onto terrestrial aspects a little bit more, which might be a bit closer to home. How many people here have done scuba diving in the tropics, by the way? Quite a few. Oh, that's good. So it won't all be completely alien to you. So those are the broad sorts of subjects, and the first one is going to be temperature rise. A coral reef should look like this, highly productive ecosystems. Where are all the species, though? There's only about 1,000 species of corals and fish and things like that. They're all the little beasties in the rock. It's very soft rock that the limestone, which is created by the corals, make. It should look extremely rich, but in 1998, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, scenes like that changed to scenes like that because of a warming spike. Warming is not a linear, smooth increase like that. It goes a bit like a staircase. You get people who say it's not happening and stuff. I get tired of that. It's the same logic as on a staircase. And say, well, half the staircase is completely flat. I'll never get upstairs. It's a toothed story. All the corals I left in this slide, this whole area was killed, but there were a few bits which were partly alive, like the brown there. That's why I left that in to show the contrast. The rest are all these plated corals which have died, and of course it turns into rubble. Now, a question I get asked by a lot of governments and things like that is, how long will it be before it recovers? Well, marine life, these are larvae that stick onto the bottom. That, in any storm, is like a liquid sandpaper. So any baby coral or baby anything gets just graunched off in the next storm. These are sterile areas for 3 years or 5 years before they can even have a firm enough substrate to start recovery, even if there is a source of larvae, which is another issue which I'm going to talk about. The quote on the right by Nancy Knowlton from the Smithsonian rather appeals to me. It did take us all by surprise in 1998. There have been examples of warming, but going back to the 90s, people thought it might happen. It was something for the future. But this took us by surprise because you have a sort of catastrophe effect. You can have a bit of warming, no change, bit of warming, no change, bit of warming, no change, and then a tiny bit more, all falls down. And that has happened in so many examples now. I mentioned the Indian Ocean in 1998. That's been the warmest. Last 10 years or 12 years been the warmest since the ice ages and so on like that. But in the Caribbean, it was 2005, in fact. In the Pacific Ocean, which is lots of oceans in an oceanographic sense, not just really one, some areas were wiped out in both of those dates and also subsequently. I'll just mention one thing. There has been a stall in the rise in temperature. And that is largely because something called the Pacific Warm Pool has stayed the same temperature, but it's got bigger, this way, that way, and according to depth. The Antarctic Ocean has heated up another 0.5 degree or whatever it is like that. So it's only gone from 4 degrees to 4.5. You're not going to notice much of a difference, but there's a colossal volume there, and so a huge amount of heat stored in the ocean. That has a great deal of effect when it comes to the world's climate. Remember as well, I know this is not tropical, but remember as well the difference between the Arctic and the Antarctic when it comes to ecosystems. The Arctic is water surrounded by land, the Antarctic is land surrounded by water, a lot of which is extremely high altitude and which is minus 80 degrees. So it warms to minus 78. Who cares, you might think. So that's a progression at the same site that we saw.
Where is that?
That is the central Indian Ocean, the Chagos Archipelago, in fact. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. In Bahrain, the Arabian Gulf is the warmest natural sea in the world, which contains reefs, that is. It's not quite landlocked, but it's highly saline. Depauperate in species sort of naturally, because not a lot can stay there, but it, the species that are there form some of the largest reefs in the world. And the biggest single reef in the Gulf was the one between Bahrain and Qatar, where they're going to build a causeway over it. But I did a project there in '85, and it was a glorious reef. And I went back again twice subsequently. No change in the last two, but that reef, the largest in the Gulf, was completely dead. Completely dead. There's a lot of denial, especially in the Gulf. I'm on the IPCC as a review member. It means other people do all the work, I just read it. But basically, there is a lot of sort of denial about these sort of things, especially in that region. And this had an amusing incident which I'm going to tell you because it's illustrative of a lot of what governments are doing all around the world, in the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and so on. Basically, after this project, I had to give a debrief to the minister, who happened to be the younger brother of the Crown Prince. He was by His Royal Highness himself. It's a privately owned country, right? I won't be too rude, I'm being recorded. But essentially, I went to see His Highness, and his office was about the size of this university, not this room, it's colossal. And after all the dates, I went in with the Bahraini member for environmental monitoring. Now, I hadn't heard of it. And he was looking rather bewildered because he hadn't heard that anyone was in his country anyway doing environment quotes. And anyway, he turned to, the prince turned to this chap and asked him, and how is my reef? And he said, well, it's gone down by, 5 or 10%, Your Majesty, Highness, whatever. And then he turned to me and said, well, that's good news, isn't it? What do you think? I said, well, actually, sir, use the word sir, it gets you out of a lot of scrapes. It's completely dead. And here are the photos to prove it. And there was a little bit of consternation. Temperatures went up, volumes went up, they switched back to Arabic, and I just thought it was time to leave, just let them get on with it. In Qatar, in the country beside there, I was taken by students, very keen students at the university there. The reefs around Qatar were written up in Nature in the 60s as being such glorious and unexpectedly rich habitats. Well, in 2 dives of 1 hour each on these glorious reefs, I saw, and I'm not exaggerating, promise, not one live coral, live fish, or live anything bigger than that. What is happening is a slope, sliding down a slope in such areas, because what does come in are the bio-eroding organisms, because limestone is very soft rock, so things are bored away. To turn it into rubble, into sand, and so on like that. We're getting huge explosions of prokaryotic organisms, which means the bacteria, the blue-green algae as we call them, and things like that. Slime, to anyone who's not an aficionado of it and who isn't in life sciences. And it's been proposed, and this was science, I think, that said these areas are regressing to a Precambrian state. The evolutionary trend is going backwards. It's quite interesting. One big problem I face in civilized countries like Australia, in some which aren't quite, like in the Arabian Gulf, some in the Caribbean, is talking with engineers, environmental assessments. If you tick a box, you get the approval to do it. And I'd like to make a dictionary, and I've got no end of these sort of things. People talk about reclaiming a reef. They're not reclaiming it, they're claiming it for the first time. Don't forget that flat land in shallow water is prime real estate. Coral reefs are priced more. Let's distinguish between value and price. Are priced more if they're no longer reef, if they're a substrate. And you have a borrow pit. In order to make it land, you scoop up all this seagrass bed, which is a nursery ground for fish, prawns, shrimp, the local people, if you like, and that's dumped on the reef, so you're actually destroying two habitats. And engineers call it a borrow pit. They're not going to give it back. And this is a great one. There's soil improvement, which means in making it flat. You see, I believe that engineers have a genetic characteristic which we don't have. They like to pour concrete on flat land. It's just there. Oh yes, a report. Always keep a copy when you go. If you go into this profession, always keep a copy of what you write. Something under 2 meters of concrete, my report was changed to ecosystem received some impact. And there is this complete sort of disjunct between the science and engineers who have a lot of tame environmental scientists who, well, fees are better than you might deserve. I won't go into it any more than that. Coral reefs as a whole. This pie chart applies to the Indian Ocean, but it's very similar for any other ocean basin or globally. About a fifth of reefs are effectively dead already because not just climate change, but because climate change impacts, warming, acidification, I'll come to later, has a synergistic effect with all the other things we do to reefs, like overfishing, like dumping sewage or industrial forms of pollution onto it, and so on like that. This group, that's 2008. It hasn't been done since, except the trend's going the wrong way. These reefs are kind of dead as well, in which case you can imagine about a third of reefs are dead. Now, another question I often get asked is, can they recover? Well, we don't know is the answer. There's one small bay in Jamaica where a recovery has been seen. But by and large, what we have observed empirically is that the movement's a bit like a ratchet in an old-fashioned clockwork mechanism. It goes one way. You can remove the sewage, you can stop overfishing, you can do what you like, but it stays in the altered state. I'll show you the reason why. So that where you have a natural place, like the Chagos Archipelago, where I do a lot of work, which is not inhabited for various reasons, which has no overfishing, no fishing of any sort at all, no pollution, no people of any sort at all, both there, and I'm comparing that with the Seychelles, where there is pollution, there is fishing and everything like that. Both were pretty good. Now, a healthy reef system has about 30 to 50% coral cover. There's a lot of other things on a reef too, if it's really healthy. After the wipeout, they both dropped like to the same amount there, but then recovery happened where there was no other impact. The Seychelles is still like that. The Seychelles, of course, is where beautiful people go for their honeymoons or what have you. You know, you can pay $2,000 a night. I don't. If I go on a research grant, it's a little more economical. But they do. So you see these people on the beach. I want another pina colada, and they're lying on a sandy beach. But what's happened there, when all the reefs have died, the sand gets washed off, and it's a jagged base. Well, such people are not happy when the beach has gone that they are paying $2,000 a night to lie on. you see. So they complain. And the revenue of the Seychelles, for example, 40% of it is beach-based tourism. The Maldives, it's over 80%. So they're kind of worried. I'm emphasizing here synergistic effects with other with other impacts. We do a lot of what we call insults to the sea. We overfish it. So the fish remove the grazing and so on like that. We alter the, I'm going to go into this slightly later on, alter the ecosystem. Pollution stresses it. Everything that causes a stress interact together, and in a lot of parts of the world, the climate change has been the straw that breaks the camel's back. If you look at it this way, you can suffer from, and I have, and I've survived because I'm young and fit, measles, malaria, whooping cough, flu, and a few other things like that. If you got them all at the same time, it would kill you. Get them one after the other, you can recover. If you're malnourished because you've overfished and the ecosystem can no longer support it because climate change has killed it off, you're malnourished as well, and you will die from it. And that's where I said, you know, it's a six-figure sum. It's very hard to attribute what the proportions are of mortality caused by all these things. Now, how does it kind of work? For reefs, and as with other systems, imagine sort of energy states, if you like. Here you have a coral reef, and here you have on the right, you have after the reefs have died. What happens? Seaweed, the slime, the Precambrian ecosystem takes its place and stays there, at least as far as we know, for several human generations. Might not be forever, but for human generations it certainly does. Imagine you have an energy kind of valley at the top. If you stress it a little bit of warming, a little bit of industrial pollution, for example, the ball's going to wobble a bit, it's going to fall back into the same sort of valley. It's still a coral reef. But say you have pollution, reduces the height of the valley. Say you have your measles, whooping cough and malaria. You've got industrial pollution, sewage, overfishing and warming and acidification, which means an extra big shove to the ball. It goes into the algae valley and it stays there. It never comes back. And we can see algae valleys all over the world now, and they produce nothing of any value to human beings. So even if you're not a tree hugger and like to see the reef because it's a wonderful ecosystem, if you are the government and only think in terms of how am I going to feed my people, on the right there it's bad, and on the left it has gone. And a lot of countries of the world are suffering greatly from that. Remember also, when it comes to reefs, about 50 nation states at the UN, 50 or so, are built entirely from the coral animal. All the atolls, half the Pacific Islands. Another, quite a lot, have a big proportion which have shorelines protected by reefs. We have to think in terms of science about how to convey the problem to government. I'll mention one example I had in the Caribbean, where the reefs had died for all these reasons, and it was the reef acts as a wave break, a natural free wave break. So the higher wave energy was hitting the roads and it eroded it away, and behind it was that particular state's oil farm where they have the tankers, big tanks, is all imported. So my debrief there, I went to see the chief minister, they called person, and I pointed out that they had this problem. She knew about that, but said, well, how long will it be before I have to worry about it? I hate that kind of question because it implies a precision that we can't give, uncertainty. But, you know, very roughly I said, 8 to 10 years. Well, that's all right, then I won't be in office then. So we as scientists have got to recognize that the urgent, immediate issues that a country and the government have to deal with are not necessarily those which are most urgent for the country as a whole or for its people as a whole. And you've got to understand that before you get anywhere. One reason why things... Yeah, go on.
Sorry, what does the ball represent here?
The ball represented a state, the coral reef state. So you push it from a reef state, you reduce the height of the valley by overfishing or what have you. You give an extra big shove because of climate change. It ends up in an algae state. That was the general idea. You probably all know about hysteresis. It's what I was talking about essentially before. If you just switch off the pollution, it won't necessarily return in the same way. Hysteresis is an engineering sort of concept, which, but a trajectory like that, if you release the pressure, doesn't necessarily go back in the same way that you cause all the damage in the first place. Ocean acidification. Well, CO2 has two effects, immediate effects as far as I'm concerned. One is the thermal blanket it causes to warm up the planet a bit. Don't forget something we talked about earlier. Don't forget, when we talk about global change, we do not necessarily mean Britain's change. We do not necessarily mean the climate change that will happen in the county of Warwickshire. To put something, just a very shorthand, extremely simple, a lot of research has been done. It's not going to happen in your lifetimes, I don't think. But the Gulf Stream goes from Florida up to Britain, keeps us warm. The same latitude over in Canada ices up. The sea freezes every winter. If the Gulf Stream were to be depressed, and it has happened in the past, we can tell by cores, which we take from the ocean bed, the Gulf Stream will be depressed down, we will freeze up. We will have Britain cooling. We'll still have global warming, and that is what the Daily Mail thrives on, you know, oh look, it's got colder, you can't say it's global warming kind of trashy stuff. Actually, I don't know if you heard on the news recently, the editor of one tabloid said, my job as editor is to sort the wheat from the chaff, and then I print the chaff. Which was remarkably honest. And he felt that if his readers weren't indignant at the end of an issue, he had failed. No, you can't be indignant unless you print the trash, maybe. The other effect of CO2 is acidification, because CO2 dissolves in the water, becomes a carbonic acid, that dissociates, is in equilibrium with a bicarbonate, and that likewise with carbonate. It's the same system as the buffer in your blood. If you hyperventilate to the point where you nearly sort of pass out, you feel sort of all peculiar because of the pH change in the blood. It's exactly the same system. The corals, foraminifera, a lot of plankton secrete limestone as part of their outer casing. They take the carbonate. And it's a little counterintuitive because when you get more dissolving in the oceans, the water gets more acid and the equilibrium shifts state, and the deposition physiology of the animal cannot lay down limestone so much. So calcification caused by CO2 dissolving is increasing. This, a map of Cornwall, this is an enhanced image. These are that little beastie at the top there, diatoms. They take limestone, a dissolved calcium carbonate out of the water, they lay down this shell around them, and zillions of them make these clouds of calcifying plankton, and they're struggling. Another important part of the plankton is the pteropod, and they're called ocean potato chips because everything eats them. In fact, a colleague of mine down at Plymouth said the British addiction to fish and chips, will have to revise that and get used to jellyfish and chips, which was a good line, which was printed a lot, but it's that sort of thing that we sometimes have to use to get the newspaper's attention. Ocean acidification. Well, these are levels of ppm, parts per million, of CO2 in the atmosphere. It takes 20, 30 years, or something like that, for the atmosphere to equilibrate with the oceans. So what is in the atmosphere now isn't reflected in the oceans. If we kept the CO2 in the atmosphere exactly the same as it is now, the acidity of the oceans would increase, the pH would drop for the next 20 to 30 years. Now, the Copenhagen conference happened a couple of years ago, was generally said to have been a failure. Well, it was a failure in the sense that the politicians couldn't agree. They all wanted to have their picture taken by a statue of the mermaid shaking hands, agreeing, to 400, we're going to cap CO2 at 450 ppm, which is, now, some of us wrote an article, which we circulated to time that, which said that the lethal limit, equilibrium kind of limit, is 350 parts per million. I think foresters did the same sort of thing as well, and we timed it to really hit them. It fell into disunity and discord because they were all told, as were the press, that any agreement for 450 would be signing the death warrant for any calcifying life in the oceans, which is half the plankton, on which life all over depends. So the meeting failed. It didn't fail, actually. They all went away scratching their heads to think again.
So you're saying that the biologist's letter prevented disagreement?
Well, the publication, it was a review led by the Australians. I was on it too. That plus, there were equal ones from forestry and other people like that. We just sort of hit them all, showing that if they agreed to 450, all these big handshakes, look, we've agreed. No, don't agree. Don't agree on that, because that would have been a step backwards in reality.
Does your PowerPoint online have the bibliographical references?
No, that's an omission. I will certainly add that one. Showing, I think it's got 350 is the top kind of level, little limit or something like that in the title.
But if we're at 380?
No, we're not. We're at 400 now.
Oh, right.
Earlier this year we hit 400.
So by the time that equilibrates with what's in the ocean, it will be too late?
It will be. It will be. What does that
so if we
tell
stop
us?
right now,
Yes. Now, okay, we aren't affected. Well, our rate of breathing depends on CO2 and stuff, so we might breathe a little heavier, but I haven't heard that particularly. Yes, but you've got to remember, or people should remember too, that life on land depends on life in the oceans. I'm not just talking about humans who eat the fish, I'm talking about life on land. For 2 billion years, if I remember right, there was no life on land, but there was life in the ocean. It's never happened the other way around. The plankton, including those diatoms, make half the oxygen in the atmosphere. They need this. I think it's a lot more scary than people are prepared to realize. In fact, I'll give you one example of why people... I was talking to this minister in the Foreign Office, in the courtyard, built to impress Indian Maharaja, so it was quite good. You're not allowed red wine because that would stain the white marble. You understand from your sitting rooms, I know that. But basically, this minister, I won't name him, he came up to me, basically, he had heard I was a scientist, you see, and I had had a glass or two, and he asked me, do I believe in climate change? And I said, no, sir, I don't. He thought, well, here's a scientist alleged, which might be useful. So I said, well, I analyse its effects and I measure it, but you should leave your belief for inside a church. And I thought it was clever, but that's what happens after you wouldn't understand that. So he had a minder who got between him and me, shoved me away a bit. No one talks to a minister like that. What can you do? I lost it, so I went off and had another one of their very fine wines, I think. But that's a sort of obstacle that you have. What can a minister do when you say the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is already too much to save the diatoms and the pteropods? What's a diatom? What's a pteropod, He didn't come to Warwick. That was... These two pictures, we are between the two bottom ones. Simplified green, good, brown, bad. These are areas where, with equilibrium amounts of CO2, the green bits you can calcify. The blue dots are where the reefs are. But plankton is everywhere, not just at the reefs, of course. You can see the constriction that has happened. This is historical. And the forecast and models. I'm not going into modelling. I think it's elsewhere in your course. But 2050, where is the calcification going to happen? I haven't put all the numbers in there, but I thought that good and bad is kind of easier. So look what the trajectory is. Now, when it comes to CO2, yes, it's increasing, but the rate of increase is increasing. We're not even starting to get a handle on this. I think it was the Kyoto one said you've got to try and reduce it. Don't forget there's no such thing, I was told by my students in law, as international law. A country might adopt the international sort of protocol and pass it through, in this case our own parliament, and say it is now UK law, or however it works. But you can opt out. China opted out because it said it was a developing country. Well, they were civilized about 2,000 years before anywhere in Europe, of course. So they get the competitive advantage. So the United States says, well, if they're not going to, I'm not going to. So here you have the two major CO2 producers saying, well, it's not going to apply to us. We do. A few small countries do. It's not really enough. So that is a political sort of issue, isn't it? Without an international law to make this happen, what is going to happen? Well, let's ask at the end, if you like. You say what is going to happen. One quirk of CO2, or any gas actually, is more dissolves in cold water than it does in warm water. I've called it the nutcracker effect. Warming affects the reefs more, those sort of high production, high diversity habitats, because they're already warm, they're already very close to their lethal kind of level. Their optimum kind of functioning is only about 1 or 2 degrees closer, less than what will kill them. Dangerous place to be maybe, fine, but they've had a stable environment since the last ice ages ended about 15,000 years ago. So the 1 or 2 degrees rise now is what is proving to be lethal. The solution, on the other hand, the dissolution into water happens more in colder water. So you've got the acidification happening more from the poles squeezing northwards, or squeezing towards the equator. Pteropods, those small shell-like forms of plankton, one of the 5 basic food chain sort of bases, are being dredged up from the Antarctic now with shells that are pitted, which are redissolving because the pH has dropped already. You've got to remember too that a drop in pH of 0.1 doesn't sound much. The oceans will never go acid, but it's about 8.4, whatever it is. It's sort of regional. But it's dropped on average about 0.1. Doesn't sound much. 8.4 to 8.3, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is it's a log scale, it's about a 30% increase in hydrogen ions, acidity, if you like, in the water. By 2050, which is a year you lot are going to be around for anyway, they're talking about a 3-fold increase in the amount of hydrogen ions in the water, the amount of acidity in the water. And that would be a drop of, gosh, I haven't done the sums, but about 0.3 or something like that. So in other words, it doesn't need much for a drop. So you're getting this squeeze, acidification and warming, squeezing on ecosystems in the middle. The Great Barrier Reef. They can't, I don't think, tell how much of it is due to warming and how much due to acidification and how much from nutrient runoff from all the cane fields in Queensland and so on. But about its rate of calcification has slowed down significantly. That was a paper in Science. Sea level rise. This is a fun one. You see the cartoon on the left, but that is a very real picture, and there's no end of those in places like Indonesia. That, I think, is the Philippines. Warming causes, and CO2, ice melt, there is sea level rise. It's not the same all around the world, but there's 2 or 3 aspects to sea level rise. Let's say you're in a part of the world which has a sea level rise of 1 centimetre. Well, only about 1/3 of it, roughly, is caused by ice melting. Not so much as you might expect, because all the rivers of the world have been dammed, so the water never gets to the sea. The Colorado, I understand, is dry at the entrance into the Gulf of Mexico now. It's all sort of taken off for other purposes, such as agriculture. Another great chunk is thermal expansion. You all know if you heat a bar of metal, you'll get longer. Well, the average depth of the ocean is 3 or 4 kilometers. Expand that by half a degree, it gets a bit longer and is expanding. So those two are the main causes of sea level rise as well. It's compounded by glaciers which are melting faster or what have we, so more does go in, but that's an accelerating rate. Now, I've been to Bermuda a few times. There's a marine institution there. Do you remember, and we hope to get a person who is influential on this to talk to you later in the course from the British government. Do you remember, maybe you don't, George Bush II was a denier of climate change for a long, long time. He probably still secretly might be, but overnight he changed. Overnight he changed. And it wasn't because of me hugging a tree. It was because of the reinsurance industry. The reinsurance industry, I'm not quite sure of the difference between reinsurance and insurance, but they have the bigger business jets in Bermuda anyway. All these are offices of the reinsurance industry. And I kid you not, there I've seen a pink and a blue one, his and hers. You know, I don't know whether maybe they're not sort of speaking to each other anymore, or one goes off to shop in New York and one goes off to Houston to make more money. But those buildings are satisfyingly close to present sea level, I think. And basically, they rang up, and if we get this chap from the Foreign Office to talk to you, if he can make the time, he will confirm that essentially they rang up and said, "Look, George, I've had to sell my Rembrandt or something like that, because the insurance claims, which are climate related, are increasing exponentially. Nothing like that to focus the mind." So the rate's increasing, and it varies. Now, the IPCC before, about a month ago, said up to about 1/4 metre rise on average. The new one,
When?
or by the end of the century, or 2080 is what they talk about. Too far away, I think, because everyone says, "Oh, someone else's problem." But anyway, it's what they do. In the new one out 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, they have doubled that to up to 1/2 metre. Now, the IPCC doesn't do research on its own. It assimilates everyone else's, including some of our own, I suppose, but including hundreds of other stuff. Uncertainties it doesn't like, and it tended to leave out some. There was a long argument about whether even newer results on sea level rise should be included, but were left out because it's still too new. I'll explain that in a minute. The newest results, which will almost certainly be in the next report, which might be 3 or 5 years' time, will talk about up to 2 metres rise. Remember, 50 nation states are only that high above high tide now. Why is that? Well, one of the new things being talked about, which I haven't seen in the present one, I didn't talk about sea level rise in my own aspect of work, but essentially self-gravity of the ice. There's so much ice over Greenland, for example. If you are a ship going from the equator up to Greenland, you rise relative to the centre of the Earth 8 metres. Now, there's a lot of self-gravity there. There's a lot of ice mass. Not from that which is on the Arctic itself, because that displaces what it's floating on. But it's thought, of course, when that melts, which is happening increasingly quickly, of course, then the water mass won't stay there. It'll disperse across the ocean. So that tropical areas might have all their estimates, might need to be revised upwards by about 1/3, just from that reason alone. Antarctica is different. I'm not going to go into that. Shoreline energy, yeah.
I just wanted you to explain what you mean by self-gravity a little bit.
Well, gravity comes from mass.
Yeah.
You shove lots of mass in ice over Greenland, it sucks water everywhere towards it. It's an inverse square law or something, so it's not even. When that melts, the water won't stay there, it'll disperse, so the gravity sucked towards Greenland will go, so all that water will just flow out. So estimates of sea level rise are increased by about 1/3 just from that reason alone. Coral reefs, well, that was a plantation, and obviously it wasn't planted below. Thank you.
On the previous slide, the top left graph, that was just sea level rise. Is that like a global average, or is that?
No, that was Bermuda alone. That was Bermuda in particular. Chosen because it's, I chose this one because it's got a pretty long and continuous series of measurements.
One on the left.
Oh, the one on the left, no, oh, that's a global average, just very broad. That doesn't go into centimetre detail. That just shows the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, sucked out a lot of water. That was, I missed that out, just to show that sea level change is natural, and that's the thing I often get as well. Well, it's natural, it's happened before, even more. Yeah, it has, and reefs and a lot of the coastal area was drowned and emerged and things like that. We know Britain was actually connected to France in the ice ages. So changes happen. In Britain as well, there's a lot of local effects. If you look at Britain, if you look at Scotland from the south, Britain is twisting a bit. The east coast, East Anglia and so on, is sinking faster. Scotland is rising. Isostatic rebound. The weight of ice in the ice ages was so great it depressed the rock, which works in slow motion compared to us, but it's still expanding elastically upwards, so it's actually rising up. Sweden, you see fishing villages 100 meters away from the sea. On the contrary, a lot of areas are subsiding. The land is also moving as well, making it very difficult, and global averages are notoriously inaccurate for any one particular area usually. It is not average sea level which causes ecosystem problems. Think of shoreline areas like mangroves, salt marshes, and so on. All the things where the fish breed that we eat, for example, like that. It's not at the average rise which counts in any case. It's the high tides, and it's the exceptional high tides, and they may be seasonal as well. This is a central Indian Ocean place. October, November are when you get higher than the mean rate of rise, and in fact, at the beginning of the year, you get less. Weather affects climate, these long-term signals a great deal. We do use averages to try and get an idea of trends, but you've got to remember, look at you shouldn't draw a line of best fit through such, widely spread data probably. I'd probably scold you for doing it, but I've done it anyway, just to show that there is a rise overall, but the variation is very high. The signal is quite small, and the noise in the data, if you call the annual fluctuations, if you call all the weather-driven changes noise, the noise is so much greater than the signal, it's often quite hard to get the signal out. It's becoming much easier. Pseudo sea level rise is another thing. Let's combine the two things I talked about, and then we'll stop for a cup of coffee. The Seychelles. We've got two things happening. We've got, for reasons of warming and for an unknown proportion, probably a little bit of acidification, the reefs are dead. You saw the earlier histogram where the reefs in the Seychelles haven't recovered. That's a dead Seychelles reef. It's becoming Swiss cheese. All the boring animals still bore into it because limestone's a very soft rock. So the top is year by year decreasing in height. So the gap between the sea level and the top of the breakwater is getting bigger. So the breakwater in essence then is getting smaller. Well, I was asked out there because they were worried, the beautiful people were complaining basically. Two things were happening. Some areas, some hotels were falling into the sea, some roads were covered by drifts of sand. This turns into sand, the storm might put it onto the road. What's happening? You might get a bigger beach for a year or three until that gets washed away again into deeper water where it's out of the system as far as we're concerned. So the questions are always how fast will it recover? It hasn't, as you've seen. How much is it going to affect the shoreline and this sort of thing? So there's a couple of things we did. We went to several reefs, and which line should I just keep to one? Essentially, I've kept this in even though it's fairly old because we're not quite at 2014. We did this work in 2004, and it seems to be right, it seems to be borne out. Basically, the change they were worried about was the change caused by the mortality from the warming, which happened in 1998 there, in that particular location. And you can see that this is wave energy striking the shores, striking the hotel, which is just behind there. Look at the pathetic little bit of sort of armoury they've shoved in there. When the sand drifts and the water go into the lobby, you know, well, as I said, the beautiful people grumble. But working on the rate of degradation of reefs, because they are not recovering. There's no more new coral growth there. The breakwater continues to disintegrate. The change in energy between 2004 and what we're going to see next year is about twice as much as the change they've already had so far. So they're very, very worried indeed. What can they do about it? You tell me. I don't know, sir, is the answer really. And I would emphasize that it's not necessarily just one climate change effect or even one human effect which causes it. It's a synergism very often between the effects of rising CO2 and the thermal blanket effect and the increased acidification and all the other effects like overfishing and everything like that. Coral reefs are protected by an algal ridge. This is a form of algae, red algae, which actually diverted. It's less like I'm more like a cow than this plant is to green plants. It evolved that early on. It was already there in the Cambrian. It forms a solid concrete. There was a crazy German professor who estimated how strong it was, and he came up with 8 times stronger than concrete. It's very hard indeed. It forms the first barrier. Now that is exposed at low tide, bakes in the sun. It can be tolerant to fresh water as well. It's very resistant to everything, you would think, but it is exceptionally sensitive to a drop in pH. So it's been got that way. Different organisms in the sea, remember there's so many different kinds, they're all affected by something else first. This one, which is the main wave break for about 1 billion people, is very affected by the drop in pH, and well, it disintegrates and you lose your breakwater effect. So it's a combination of all these things. It's like you having all those diseases I mentioned all at the same time. It's much worse than if you have them in different years. Shall we call a small break there, I think? It's about halfway through, I think. Does that suit? Can we say 10 minutes, I think, while we...
you know productivity increase the decrease productivity?
Actually, what reinsurance is the reselling of insurance policies. And what they do is, if I sell a top of insurance policies, and there's then they're collected to be smooth. That's how insurance works. If I can split out certain risks that cut across different policies that affect them all in a similar way, that's derivatives. And one of the derivatives that they have is something called weather risk. Right. Because the weather affects everything, so we trade that separately. But if I need to hedge against risk that will affect the whole market, I can simply use it. Now, in the case of reinsurance, they have what are called catastrophe bonds. They deal with large-scale events that are inherently uninsurable at the local level. This is what
That's where it's going to drive. That's going to be what did he do?
Just several back. Yeah, right. So
there are some of the words on this slide which I can do. But I put more politics. They don't understand about that. I don't want to, but I can certainly
things security
right. I can go through it and add a few words. Yes. Make that those two worlds, aren't
And that phenomenon is what's true. It's not true in the natural life. If you mix hot and cold water, you do tend to breach all the different positions. If you mix hot and cold in the polarization, and that's the two-part phenomenon is very important. That if we make that decreases localized hysteria, increases it will reduce the
Yes.
But in this sense, the market framework does make it worse because the fact that you can get this sort of insurance does encourage forms of development. We're building something that works in function of how you sustain it. It increases dependency rather than decrease it because the market is absorbing the risk of what you can do is you can see what is not the free offering something which is detached from what you're doing. So it's the possibility of finding the side of the the opposite.
Sure.
So before the lecture resumes, I've got two brief announcements. One is that from week 5 to week 9, we start running seminars, not so much on scientific topics, but more on the humanities side, because that seems to be the way humanities tends to teach, to encourage discussion and so on. We've got 5 seminar slots booked, but there are, for that, because we didn't know how many people would come, and we think we're going to run 3 seminars, in fact. But if you look on the website, you'll find that 5 times advertised on the calendar. That's correct. Amy, who's here from IATA, is going to put up a sign-up list on the website. We want each person to write their 3 top preferences for the seminar slot out of the 5 available. And then we're going to try to make 3 groups which will suit everybody to a greater or lesser extent. Okay?
Could I add, this is only compulsory for those people doing the 15 active.
Yes, only for the 15 active.
For people who are doing the 7.5 who are interested, by all means, sign up if you want to do them, but priority will be given to those who are doing the 15 active.
Yeah. And okay, so please do that.
Yeah, the form which will indicate, when you sign up, indicate whether you're registered for 15 or 7.5.
Yeah, okay. And the other thing is that we've organised these drop-in sessions in Ramphal for this week, for last week, this week, and next week, where you can come along and ask questions about the material in the lectures so far. Or come along and tell us what we're doing wrong or what we're doing right. Remember that this is the first time we're doing this module, and we hope to give it in future years, and we hope to improve it, and we hope to reach people on both sides of the divide between science and humanities and encourage some transmission of information across that divide. And we don't know if we're succeeding or failing. We don't know if the audience here, we don't know how many of you are in humanities and how many in sciences, whether the people in the humanities are making sense of what we're telling you, or whether we're completely missing our intended audience, which might be happening, and it's up to you to let us know if it's happening. Right? It's not. We don't want you to respond by saying, "Oh, I'm too stupid. I shouldn't be here." If you're a humanities student and you're not understanding, we're the ones who are being too stupid, and it's up to you to let us know, so that we are able to adapt and direct our lectures more appropriately. Right? We've got to reach people in the humanities, and then later on the lecturers in the humanities have got to reach the scientists. And you've got to tell us if we're not succeeding. So please, come along to the drop-in sessions. If you have any comments about the lecture or anything you didn't understand, and for heaven's sake, don't think I'm too stupid, I should hide my stupidity and go away. Right? That's the worst possible thing. Last week, a number of people came. Well, I'll let you guess how many people came to the drop-ins.
Okay, I'll continue. I'm going to whip through disease. I should just point out, first of all, that you can get a master's degree in the subject of my 2 lectures. So it's a gloss over the top, it's got to be. I'm trying to, I just get the one talk in this new course, and there are master's degrees, as I said, on this. So, hey, but you're Warwick people, aren't you? So you can manage it in one lecture. But it's going to be a challenge for those of you who don't have a science background. Marine diseases, unknown, unheard of. You can't pick up a scuba dive magazine of a couple of decades ago without seeing pictures of those glorious sea fans. They are mostly extirpated from the Caribbean now because of disease. Disease that came from a couple of different areas. One is through pathogens from human sewage being discharged. And one, I'll just go through some of them very quickly to show. Often they come, kill everything and go before the epidemiology of it has been worked out, before we know what they are. So we have these lame terms of white band disease, because they've got white bands on it, black band, white blotch. I mean, that's not, if you go to a GP and you're told you've got white blotch disease, it's not terribly specific, is it? But essentially, we don't know because they've come and gone and you can't plate them out easy enough. Here are some examples. A lot of the Caribbean, it's a sweeping statement, but it's true. There are no coral reefs shallower than about 3 or 4 meters deep in the Caribbean now. Ouch. That's sweeping. But by and large, the shallow corals have been destroyed by warming episodes, and by diseases, which just sweep through everywhere.
Could I interrupt just to ask? You said at the very beginning that huge numbers of people are dependent on coral reefs for their sustenance, because coral reefs are very productive. So in the Caribbean, is this already a noticeable effect that the absence of coral reefs are leading to a drop in...
More in areas like Sri Lanka, Mozambique, Madagascar, Comoros, places like that, Asia and Indonesia. You know, most reefs of the world are in Indonesia and the Philippines, and also going east. The Caribbean is an American holiday lake. They buy in their fish from everywhere else, up to the point when another country isn't going to sell them anymore, which is starting to happen now, because they want to eat them themselves. So the Caribbean is the most prosperous part of the tropics, if you exclude little things like Singapore, I suppose. So its effects are buffered. We in the West, and America and Caribbean, we don't live in the environment. We have Tesco's between us and the environment. Someone in a village catches his fish today, he lives in the environment. He's the one who's there's an African scientist who told me that they do DDT fishing now. There's so few fish there, partly because the EU fleets have vacuumed them all up. But when I asked what he meant, he said they are able to buy DDT. We can't use it here, so we export it instead. They pick up scoops of it, a standard handful, throw it in the water, the fish die, they eat the fish. The obvious question, isn't it harmful? Isn't it going to kill you? Not immediately as it happens because of various chemical things, but he said yes, it does kill these villagers, in about 6 months. But if they didn't eat any fish, they'd be dead before the end of the week. Now, I've gone to field sites past dead people. I mean, a lot of the world is not like Leamington Spa, you know. Diseases affect grazers as well, and this is ecology. I'm just going to hint at now that they're grazers. They keep the algae down. A disease went through the Panama Canal. This is not climate, but they're interrelated. It went through the Panama Canal, seeded itself in the Caribbean, and within a year, a wave of it went out and killed almost all, 99%, of this urchin, which was the main grazer, keeping the seaweed down. These are the kind of rapid, unexpected events. If you read Taleb and things like that, black swans and butterfly effects and things like that, which can have an unexpected consequence. You can have all the institutes in America working on this aspect, and oops, something else turns out to be the most important in the end.
What about the proposition that algae growth is good for the absorption of CO2?
Well, only transiently. It's fleshy algae, which are the fast growers, which sort of do take over. They trap it a bit, but they disintegrate pretty much immediately and release it again. So these biofuel, biomass stores are pretty transient, and they're not making much impression. Just look at CO2, which do go up. Extra diseases. Lots of diseases are there at ambient sorts of levels. They don't cause a problem. But if you cause a stress, in this case by warming or strong light, it helps kill the reefs. Here the Vibrio, well, a Vibrio is also a cholera joke, will kill the coral reefs. There are lots of pictures around like that. This is coral killed by, or half killed by, climate change. Now, the temperature of the water here is exactly the same as the temperature of the water on the dead bit. But what has happened? In the Indian Ocean, the Indian monsoon had failed. The water became glassy calm. If you ever had a camera which did those old-fashioned f-stops, you know an f-stop is a doubling or a halving of light. Underwater, same depth, just the next day, calm water, rough water, you can have a difference of 2 f-stops. It's a 4-fold difference in light that gets through, because the light's not being kind of speckled off by waves because the winds have failed. You get glassy calm, it can be oily, kind of warm patches. That had more light than that, that's the only difference. And the photosynthetic pathway just burned out. So it's a combination. We use warming as a shorthand for all these kind of interrelated biological things. Okay? A global problem. How does the disease get there? It's come from the Mississippi, which drains the farmlands of America. But look at this picture. This one is dust transport to the Caribbean. The sea fans I showed you first of all were killed by an Aspergillus bug, which is not normally there. It's a natural inhabitant of African soil, harmless there, but over agriculturing it, and that's not the right word, but over cultivation makes the soil friable. Some call it the Toyotarization, just breaking up with Toyota tractors and things. The dust storms take the dust, stuck onto which are the bugs, all the way across to the Caribbean. It first came to attention because of health aspects, for a great increase in asthmatic attacks for people who are sufferers of that and so on. But it also went into the sea and killed all the sea fans. Africa's topsoil is being blown across the Atlantic that way. China to the western USA. Every year, China's topsoil, because of the over-intense agriculture in that part of the world, on the coast there, ends up at least as far as Hawaii, and some years gets as far as California, detectably so. So this ends up as economics and politics. What happens when China has ruined all its sort of topsoil, and this area has become a dust bowl? Discuss, question mark. On to land, phenology. Phenology is the study of sort of biological changes and events. And for this one, I'm doing something closer to home. At Oxford University, they've got probably the longest bird study group in Britain. any one particular, this came out of an older IPCC one, and I've just picked out a few. Now, there are hundreds of examples. So Britain's been very good at having vicars in the old days who used to record when they first heard the cuckoo, when the daffodil first flowered, and this sort of thing. One result on its own, like, oh, the daffodils are 2 weeks early this year, or not, is not statistically powerful. But where you get hundreds and hundreds of results, all pointing the same way, or almost all pointing the same way, then that becomes a powerful estimate. And just read some of these things. I'm going to talk a little bit about one or two of the migratory patterns that we have. But essentially, climate change has caused a mismatch between, for example, the adult and its breeding and the hatching and the prey. A baby doesn't have the same food maybe as the adult. Might do, but it might not. So essentially, just sort of look at that. The birds arrive, they nest, and the hatching of caterpillars, which is their food, happen at the same time. Fine, it's been fine for thousands of years. A new peak bird hatching period, or a new peak caterpillar hatching period, might not coincide, so all the babies die. Anyone who's a member of the RSPB and get their reports every year, you will learn about the catastrophic decline in British birds because of that. I have a slide which makes it a bit clearer slightly later on. But you get a desynchronizing in the whole food chain. The baby needs to eat, the food is there. The baby needs to eat, but the food is no longer there because of something else. And it's caused because different factors trigger different things. It might be daylight length, which triggers migration, for example. It might be temperature that triggered the hatching of the larvae of the caterpillars, but the eggs will still be hatched kind of later on. Bird migration. Basically, birds migrate from Britain southwards, and there are two groups. And there are different patterns for those that only go as far as the Mediterranean, say, and those that go beyond the Sahara. Those that go beyond the Sahara to South Africa have to time, as it says there, if you're going to fly south of the Sahara, you now go earlier to avoid the Sahel's dry period, which causes great attrition. It's the opposite for those that don't go so far. And this is some of the Oxfordshire work. Look at the extra distances that climate change has been attributed to is causing these species, which some of you have seen sort of in your gardens maybe. The long distance ones have to go 300 miles longer, 5%. Now 5% of fuel, you have to feed up to build your lipid bodies to get the fuel to go that far. And if you add an extra 5% onto the energy need and you don't have it, they drop dead in the Sahara, and that literally has been what is happening all along. So even the short distance migrants are going to get the same climate where they go to. They're having to fly 125 miles more on average. And it's the stress and the lack of energy, because they just don't have that amount of fuel on board, is one of the reasons why we have had a dramatic decline in songbirds in Britain. Some, because it's warmer here, they stay here longer, they may have another brood. The UK is very buffered compared to continental areas. We're controlled very much by the Gulf Stream and the warmth there. It's a big kind of gently warm radiator all around us. So we're much more sort of stable. But even in Britain, these changes are happening. In all cases, the onset of breeding can be advanced. But as I've touched on, the difference between short distance migrants and long distance migrants, you can't use an average. A skeptic will say, has said, well look, some are longer, some are shorter. The average is the same, isn't it? Climate change doesn't have an effect. You get a lot of these sort of things. But just look at the life story of that particular species. The same applies to fish. One very interesting paper, I think it was a Nature paper a little while ago now, since the mid-1800s, early 1800s, people haven't recorded the amount of fish landed in the North Sea, because the ports in Britain go from, well, Dover right up to north of Aberdeen. They haven't measured the amount, but they know the proportion of cod to mackerel to herring, whatever it is like that. And I think of 15 species, 13 have shown a northern shift in their range. 2 didn't. 1 seemed to go eastwards. 1 didn't change at all for reasons we needn't bother with now. But that is a phenology for you. If you look at any one species, well, it's an interesting result. But when you have a mass of data all pointing the same way, that adds strength to the information. You've got to understand differences, as has been worked out at the Oxford Group, between short-term and long-term migrants, and why one will go earlier, why one will go sort of later. What about migrants from the cold north? Well, there's a drop in numbers arriving from the far north, the swans and things like that, because it's warming up in Sweden. Why should they bother to fly down? They used to fly down because it was all snowy there. They used to come down to the big estuaries here to feed. Now they don't actually bother, some of them. Some obey the same rules and will go earlier and this sort of thing, but we're seeing this kind of example as well. So it's been kind of, not scientific, but messed up in all sorts of different ways according to the biological needs, prey, breeding requirements of the species concerned. And don't forget, we don't really know how many species there are on Earth, and all of them behave in their own way. To make a general rule, well, the sort of argument I get from a politician is, you scientists can never make your minds up. Well, we might not be able to make our minds up, but we're trying our best. But essentially, they behave in different ways, but what we can see, whichever they do, leave earlier, leave later, they are responding to climate, some aspect or another. And what about non-migrants? A lot of work's been done in the USA. Look at that first line. 60% of them are moving northwards as the average temperature and the peak bits, which are important, move. Some of them hundreds of miles, and some don't, and those that don't, can't, won't, they die out. There is another slightly confusing thing, is that as you go up a mountain, you get colder. Now, if you need a temperature range to breed of, let's say, 22 degrees, you can get that if you're next to the Rocky Mountains. You can go uphill. So they might not move in latitude, but they're still going for for lower temperatures. You take an island, though, where can they go? They can't go north or south. They get to the coast, and that's it. They will become extinct. If the island is a flat island, like most of the like all the atolls in the world and things like that, they haven't got a mountain to go up. Some, in Reunion and so on, are moving upslope to get the colder conditions. What happens when they get to the top of the mountain? They become extinct from that island. And that's happening time and again. As a general rule, the background natural rate of extinction has been worked out to be, I think it's 1 or 2 per 100 years. That's happened for, since the days of the dinosaurs. Climate change and man's direct effects, and the two are synergistic, I keep emphasizing, are causing the extinction of several every day. How do we know? They're not all are the warbler or the robin in your garden. A lot of them are tiny insects. We know from indirect forms. We know, for example, in the Amazon, we have the range of species beetle X. It might be quite small range. Some are very kind of pantropical. A lot of species have remarkably small range. We know from the satellite imagery we do of the rate of attrition of the rainforest. So we can estimate the rate of attrition of species which have these small ranges. So it's enormous, and I get as well, species extinctions always happen, that's why there are no dinosaurs. Yes, sir, but look at the rate. It's the rate that's important. Okay? And this chart here is just some examples of movements within America. And if they can't change their dates disperse, move or climb higher, like here this flycatcher, not cerebrally very well endowed, it stays there. And the graph there just shows the breeding success from 1985 to 2005. Not a great time span, is it? Only 20 years. And the breeding success goes down from about 80 to 85% down to what? What are we seeing now? Not much more than half that. I'll go back to fish. I'm more sort of comfortable in the water than with birds, but I thought I'd get a bit of land and stuff in. This is species in the Mediterranean was economically important, ecologically important. It's off Spain. Because the Mediterranean warmed up more than a lot of seas actually, these fish, I'll step back, these fish go to France to breed, from Spain to France. Why, I don't know, but they do. It's a major fishery, or was a major fishery in this area. The temperature triggered them. I'll go earlier. They started to move northwards over time, so they were moving north about 2 weeks earlier. They breed. They have larvae. Their larvae eat plant plankton. The plant plankton do not have a temperature trigger, they have a daylight length trigger. So there was an increasing gap, up to 2 week gap, between when the food for the larvae appeared and the larvae appearing. So they die. This species isn't extinct in a museum sense now, but economically and ecologically it is extinct, throwing out of work, loads of villages along the coast of Spain and France. I showed you the birds and caterpillars one. That is an example in the sea. And it happens as there are so many examples, you can Google it and just see a lot of these sort of things. Now, this might make you wake up. It's changes to wine because of climate change. Apparently, wine has an alcohol content according to the glucose sugars in the grape, and that is increased if it's stressed. Warmer weather has stressed the grapes more. So there you are. There's a rise in alcohol of 2% on average over the last 30 years. That has other problems, not problems, but issues as well in economics and sort of budgets. Some countries tax wines according to the amount of alcohol in them. Well, just think through that for a moment. And ecosystems are disappearing. A lot of ecosystems are coastal because of sea level rise and warming together. Okay, ignore the engineers who are pouring lots of concrete over it. Salt marshes. Salt marshes act as a sponge. You know the Thames Barrier? Some of you have no doubt seen it. When it was first built in the 70s, it closed every 3 years because of a high surge. Wind, sea level rise, a lot of things all acting together. Now it closes 3 times a year. I think aren't they building another one? People realise you can't hold back the tide. I had a very upset lady emailing me just very recently. She lives in Dorset, and the council, English Nature or whatever, has advised that their area, their village, is one of those which is going to be managed retreat, which means just tough, leave it. We can't do anything about it. Concrete, I have a friend who's an expert in concrete. Did you know concrete gets harder and harder over a 50-year period, reaches its peak, and then gets softer and softer and crumbles away? Most of Britain's breakwaters were built about 50, 60 years ago and are on the way downhill. The cost is colossal of trying to replace them. And a lot of, awful lot of councils and things are just saying, we can't, we won't. That's a sacrificial area, let it go. But another trick that is being done is in fact to reflood areas which were reclaimed, in quotes, from the sea to make farmland, to let the sea just flood back and redevelop salt marshes. The longer the salt marsh, the more of a wave break it is, naturally and for free. If you built housing on it or factory on it, then you don't have it. But what they're doing in the Thames, they've already done in Hull, and a few other areas, is let the sea just flood into farmland, presumably the farmers are compensated somehow, and salt marshes, which act as a big sponge. Don't forget, it's high tide that causes all the damage, not just the mean. In Britain we get a high tide of so high. So it's not the mean, but a greater mean often means, and it's not really clear yet, a greater range about that mean as well. And where that happens, well anyway, just look at the Thames Barrage figures. Instead of once every 3 years, 3 times a year, in broad terms. So managed retreat is when the government says, oh sorry, we can't do anything about you, you're on your own, but we will let the sea flood back and hopefully it'll make seagrass. Seagrass, this is the difference between price and value. Of salt marshes, the only value that it had lots of years ago was for duck hunting. A peculiarly English, completely daft sport. I'm sorry if I'm upsetting people. You dress in peculiar clothes, you walk out into a marsh and blow a little thing that sounds like a duck. Ducks are not terrifically bright, they think you're a mate, they come in, bang, you shoot them. The licenses for duck hunting were at one stage, the only known value of a salt marsh. Now, oops, it's helping to prevent lots of floods. It has, so the value, they'll phrase it, the price of everything and the value of nothing. These things are also nursery grounds. Seagrasses, which are these things extended below the tide level, they are vastly efficient nursery grounds. They stabilize the shoreline and produce food.
Charles?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Do people plant this grass? Is this almost...
Some of it is, yes. Some of it is. That is a good point. They're trying to replant mangroves. We've lost 50% of the world's mangroves. Those are nursery grounds for fish par excellence. Because of the root system, which are there to stabilize the soil, the predators can't get in, and a lot of things breed in the mangroves in order to take a refuge in size. Humans have taken them away for all sorts of reasons, 50% of them now, oops, all the fish are gone. So, other aspects as well of climate change. You have the tundra melting, Arctic ice melt, and so on. You've all seen pictures of polar bear on a lump of ice, I'm sure. Now, the Arctic, you have permanent ice and you have the seasonal ice around the edge, which ebbs and flows. If you look at the Arctic from the top, there's not much of a shrinkage. It's there, but it's not much. Actually, it's enough to open the Northwest Passage. For time immemorial, Francis Drake went off to find the quick route to the Indies and the spices. It didn't exist, it was all iced up. I think it was, when was it? Just a very few years ago, it opened for the very first time ever. But from the Cold War, with all the submarines underneath, they have a sonar that looks upwards to find the thin bits of ice. They knew, and this has now been released, the data, that the Arctic ice has thinned by about 40%, almost half. So although it hasn't shrunk that much, the mass is much less. That won't affect sea level rise because it's floating anyway. But it's an indication of the warming, and it's an indication of the amount of... there are whole ecosystems that are dependent on ice, strangely. But there's one thing I will mention here, and that is the Earth's albedo. A black jumper makes you warmer if you're in the sunshine than a white one. Black absorbs heat more. Well, the ice is white, reflecting, highly reflecting. If some of that changes to dark blue, it absorbs. So we have this possibility, it's one of the tipping point things like that. There will come a point when not only is the ice melting, but because more of what was white is now becoming blue, it's absorbing more in a self-perpetuating sort of like acceleration.
Well, this was positive feedback.
Positive feedback is what I was trying to avoid. But yes, positive feedback.
This is what Andrew explained in his lecture.
There you go. There's another positive feedback as well, cleft rates. Anyone chemistry might know that, but basically it's methane kind of locked up on the seabed under pressure and things like that. As the ice passes over, anyway, the methane bubbles up, and it's being seen in the Arctic right now. Methane is much stronger greenhouse a gas than CO2. Okay, it alters into CO2 eventually, but you're getting a sort of a runaway positive feedback. Possibly they're starting to see it now. It's been reported these clathrates are bubbling up methane now. You get it from the tundra as well. Russia, for example, Putin the Magnificent, he made a comment on, well, we could do with a bit more warming, we'll have a better crop season. Fine, but half his cities are built on permafrost. Cracking, ouch, different thing. They are liberating methane, off-gassing of methane which was locked up in the, underneath all the peat. It's the same for Canada as well, is now being released into the atmosphere, leading to a runaway effect. And that is warming. The average or the changes over the years, over the decades, we're seeing more warming, more release of methane. I was at one meeting where UN University it was, where they talked, somebody was asked to talk there who was in charge of the Japanese fleet of tankers. And he was very excited about the Arctic ice going, because as he said now, he could get his ships in to get the gas more easily. That's a wonderful example of an engineered positive feedback. I mean, that's his business, that's his job. So that was good business for them, if they can get the gas more easily, cheaper and this sort of thing. You know, the Greenpeace folk in jail at the moment, they're sort of protesting about this. We shall see. People and mortality. Now, this is where it comes home, the human condition. I've been told at several conferences, UN or EU based, organised and paid for, don't mention human populations. It's sensitive, it upsets people, whether it's Catholics, Muslims, whatever it is like that, or lots of groups. Human rights, it's my human right to have 8 children if I want to, sort of thing. Well, I don't usually obey, and I was giving one talk, there were 400 to 500 people in the auditorium, you know, and it was on a small island, it was on small island sustainable development. And I said, do we know how many people are sustainably supportable by this island in the Indian Ocean? And I was told I was a people killer. I promise, I had not suggested everyone be castrated before they leave the auditorium. All I had said is, do we know how many can be supported? Now in maths, I might be right, I might be wrong, I don't think you can solve an equation if you're not allowed to think about one of the terms, a big important term in the equation. You're at a disadvantage. But we're just not allowed to. So, but you know, you should anyway, because it was Ian Stewart in maths here and Jack Cohen, who was a life science friend of mine, worked out for Terry Pratchett, and they wrote it up in the journal I edit, actually, that one person is equal to half a car in terms of CO2. Now, I won't go into all the torturous stuff about that, but if you were told that the Earth's going to have to support the output from 1 billion more cars by 15 years' time, you'd be horrified. But the projections are there's going to be 2 billion more people, which have the same effect. It's a difficult problem. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm sure there are whole floors of the United Nations devoted to thinking up nice terms. Like, you can't talk about undeveloped countries anymore. You talk about a developing country. Well, that's a lie. For half of them, they're sliding backwards in any sort of measure you care to mention. But it's nicer to say it. One rather sarcastic person said human resource rich countries, which is true, but it's difficult, isn't it? It is kind of difficult. And when you think that has as much effect on the climate of the world and the rate of climate change, don't forget rate is as important as amount. If you're going to adapt, a quick change you can't cope with, but a species might be able to cope over many generations for that. So it's a difficult issue, and we've got this chart here. This came from the Lancet. I've got updated figures, and that 54 is 56. Look at this, deaths related to malnutrition, 54%. Now, if you are in Mozambique or something, they don't have a death certificate anyway, but if there was, in the sampling that's been done, those are the diseases then, which actually carry you off, essentially. And, but no government wants to say, well, I can't feed my people. They would put measles on the death certificate, not, well, they were so weak they died from anything, which is what happens. That is increasing. That is mostly the fast growth rate countries. As I said, that's now 56, and the latest Lancet had a series of these. What does this mean, malnutrition? It means that the ecosystem can no longer support the people. Ignore whether it's increasing or not. It just can't do it. So the climate change effects are another death by 1,000 cuts, okay? So the climate change shortages, the shortages caused by climate change are causing an inability of reefs. A quarter have gone, maybe half now. Mangroves, half have gone. Seagrasses, half have gone. These support people. So what I'm emphasizing is that this is not something to think about for the future. It is that as well. In a lot of countries which do live in the environment, unlike us, who don't have a Tesco's, they are well on the trajectory already. And some estimates are that, some estimates are in the hundreds of thousands of people a year are dying from climate change. Think resource shortages. You can't tease it away from resources as well. In Africa at the moment, someone told me, I don't know if it's true or not, there's 16 wars going on. You know, they don't usually hit the news at all. Why are they fighting? If there was enough fish there for you and me, I wouldn't try and, kind of fight you. We would be okay. But if there's only one fish left, I would clobber you on the head because I want it for my family, and sort of vice versa. Reporters never get below the surface. Oh, this is tribal, or this is just Africa. All these rather useless, very shallow reporting things. If you look behind, a lot of it, it's because of resource shortages and climate change, which is changing rainfall. I haven't even touched that at the moment. Massive changes in rainfall, massive changes in vectors of diseases, like where the mosquito grows, or the bilharzia vectors grow. These sort of things are shifting their ranges, as well as making it harder and harder to grow the crops which you are used to, and the crops which you can grow, in order to feed. So we have food security now. You won't get a grant in the biological sciences unless you use the buzzword food security a dozen times in a grant application. What does it mean? It means having enough basically to eat. Britain does things like ban GM foods and things like that. Have you seen the cartoon of some starving African kids? You know, those horrible sort of pictures of flies and bloated bellies, where they say, oh, I'm not going to eat that, it's GM. What do we do? That is a question. I don't have the answers. What I try and do is provide a lot of the data behind it to help inform.
Just this one of the seminars will be on food security.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And of course there's a strong positive feedback in this element as well.
Yeah.
Because the need to feed those peoples led to the Green Revolution and those very, very thirsty crops that they've developed.
Yes, yes indeed. And more people to start with.
And soil breakdown.
And more people to start with. I've been called, as I said, a people killer. Not a baby killer. That was usually reserved for the American airmen in Vietnam, wasn't it? But I was a people killer. There we go. So one last thing. Where did all the fish go? Well, that's where. This is aerial from the South China Sea trawling. We have just taken out fish from everywhere. The world's fish are in crisis. Fishing is probably the most ecosystem distorting activity we have done to our oceans. Up to now, more than acidification, more than warming, it has caused ecological extinction of so much of it. You can now trawl down to 2 kilometers depth with enormous ships. The net of the largest one, launched recently, can encompass 7 jumbo jets in it. They're that big, and they just strip the seabed completely. It used to be in France and Britain that we would hang people for trawling. It was recognized to be so bad. Now, We subsidize it. Why? Market desperation, economics, I don't know why it is. Management is a big deal as well, managing the oceans, it is pure hubris. We can't manage anything. What's it mean? Are you going to tell the fish to breed more, something like that? What we can do is manage human impact on the environment. We can manage people's interactions with it, but don't kid yourself that anyone can do anything else. Look at DEFRA. They're all well, also management is a phrase you have to get into everything. And we come up with the daftest, biologically incorrect answers. You know the idea that you throw the little fish back because they're not old enough to breed. It's exactly wrong. For 10 kilograms of fish, if you save the big fat mama, she'll produce many, many, many more eggs and equal biomass, equal weight of the smaller ones. So what you should do is throw the big ones back. That would be the biologically correct thing to do if you want to keep them. You can't create a net, of course, which will do that, so it's a pragmatic thing. What we can do and are doing is to create complete protected areas, huge opposition from a lot of people, where they can be allowed to grow up and to produce. And we're working on networks of no-take marine zones, like the terrestrial zones around the world, in order to let the big ones grow up. Poaching is incredibly difficult. There's no point in trying to make one next to Dar es Salaam, for example, or Jakarta. Nobody will be able to enforce it. It's a very difficult problem, and we're running out of ocean where we could perhaps do this. We're making a start. Next week I'm talking about that in France. Sorry.
So could we design a net to do exactly that? Instead of having a fully protected refuge, have it surrounded by a net through which the big fish cannot pass, and fish outside catching the little ones.
Well, there's a good idea, and I shall mention that. Who are you going to get to do it? It would be a nice idea.
Another question. I read recently that cod stocks have increased in some parts. I think the North Sea.
In some parts, they are starting.
Of this kind of measure, is that correct?
They're starting to increase in some areas. The signs are there. Now, one thing I've recently published in the journal I do is an assessment of the EU quotas over time. What the scientific input is, like you must not fish more than this amount, and what the EU actually allowed. And I think consistently, well, certainly consistently, just about universally, quotas are higher than what the scientists have said you mustn't exceed if you're going to let the stocks recover. And I'm going to make a plea for the sciences here. Mother Nature rules, okay? She's got her rules. Whatever you like, however you try to manage it, the fish will breed according to their biology. So input into advice from the scientists, it's treated by the EU, for example, as another stakeholder thing to engage with. It might be, well, let's also think about what the fishermen think. Would they like to do it, and this sort of thing? And they've got to pay off their trawler fleet. And well, that's another stakeholder as well. That's why it is not working. That is why the fish in the world as a whole are declining very rapidly now. It used to be you could move on to somewhere else, but now there's very little places to move on to. So the overall decrease in a downward slide is increasing faster. So how are we going to do it? Well, how are we going to get a good reef back? How are we going to get mangroves back? It costs more to replant them. It's much more sensible not to take them out in the first place. But, in a lot of countries of the world, there's very poor regulation. In a lot of countries like this one, probably, we've got a lot of regulation, but it's just regulating the wrong thing because it can be done, whereas the other things are too difficult to think about. But remember, okay, it's a special pleading for my subject perhaps, but biology determines what is going to happen, whatever the economic drivers are, whatever the political imperatives are, and things like that. And that's the clash, which you guys are going to go into the profession and sort it out where we messed up. I'll leave it there. Okay.
Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. Do remember if you have questions, queries, please come to the comment section.
Or views, please.